Great evening, everyone, and welcome again to session 4 as we count down our 6-week series on the politics of Jesus, facilitated by Dr. Obery Hendricks, PhD. And as you already know, I am Dr. Karen Owens, Director of Strategic Research at Hood Theological Seminary, and I also serve there as adjunct faculty. We ended last week's session with treat the people's needs as holy, referencing Matthew 6 and Luke 11. Tonight's session is titled, Be the Voice of the Voiceless, Mark 11, verses 15 through 19. So please remember to keep your devices muted throughout the session, and by the end of the week, tonight's recording will be sent to your email addresses. And also, if you have questions or comments, please simply type them in the chat. And this free course offering is presented via the Pathways for Tomorrow initiative of the Lilly Endowment Incorporated. And I also want to thank Mr. John Everett, Ms. Kelly Bryant, Mrs. Sandra Oliver, and Dr. Virgil Lattimore for their valued assistance and support. Dr. Hendricks, welcome back, and I'll turn it over to you at this time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Owens. It's good to see everybody this evening. Today we're going to talk about, I think, one of the more important strategies of Jesus. I'm looking at my sweater. Oh, excuse me, I just came from the gym. That's why I'm looking sort of ratty. But don't hold it against me now. I'm still a child of God. Well, all right. So we're going to be talking about what I think is one of the more important strategies from the politics of Jesus. You know, Jesus was a strategist and a tactician, meaning that he strategically planned out and had an end goal in mind for the things that he did. And I see a former student when I was president of Payne Seminary, Bruce Butcher, huh? All right, I just happened to see that pop up. I had to acknowledge him. So let's begin by reading Mark. I'm going to start by Mark 11:11, that after Jesus' triumphal entry. Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. I'll skip to verse 15. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers? And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. So, I'm going to begin by just introducing it by reading a passage from the politics of Jesus. For centuries, Christians have been taught that Jesus' dramatic demonstration at the temple was a purely religious act. Either he was decrying its lack of spirituality, or he was protesting commercialization of his worship practices, or he was railing against rogue money changers for overcharging worshipers for the Jewish shekels they needed to make acceptable offerings, or he was critiquing the temple's legalistic, externally oriented worship in order to establish, or at least inspire, a more pure, more spiritual mode of worship. I have legalistic in quotation marks because that's sort of that's a critique that has been leveled against the temple hierarchy, particularly against the Pharisees. But that's not necessarily the case. Okay, I'll just leave that there. Though they vary in their details, all these interpretations have this in common. Each considers Jesus' action in the temple to be purely religious. That is why all of them miss the point, that Jesus was not committing a purely religious act by attacking the money changers and dove sellers, for the simple reason that the Jerusalem temple was not a purely religious institution. Even though the temple was the religious center of Jewish life, it was also much more. It was the governing institution of Israel, the center of Israel's political life and power. It was at the temple that the high priest held court and presided over the powerful Sanhedrin council. It was at the temple that the priestly aristocracy obediently represented Roman interests to their own people, at times even collecting taxes to place in Roman hands. It was at the temple that priests issued pronouncements and decisions that affected the life of every Jew in Israel. But more than that, the temple was the center of Israel's economy, its central bank and treasury, the depository of immense wealth. Indeed, so much of the activity of the Jerusalem temple hinged upon buying and selling and various modes of exchange that it is no exaggeration to say that in a real sense, the temple was fundamentally an economic institution. That is why what seems to have been simply a burst of outrage against wayward merchants was in reality much, much more. It was a very public attack aimed at Israel's center of power. In other words, it was an overtly political act. Mark's gospel makes this clear. It tells us not only that Jesus attacked the money changers and dove sellers, but that he and his followers also seized the temple grounds and temporarily halted commercial operations. Why? Because despite its veneer of holiness and religiosity, beneath its proclamations of justice and concern, the temple did not treat the people's needs as holy. So, Mark's narrative doesn't leave much doubt that this is what was on Jesus' mind when he did the so-called cleansing of the temple, because he even quotes, when he says den of robbers, he's referring to Jeremiah 7, 1 through 15. I'm going to read it. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. I'll move it down. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim this word and say, hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah, you that enter these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings and let me dwell with you in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. Quote, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. For if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly one with another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your ancestors forever and ever. I'll stop there. So, there's much to talk about here, but suffices to say that there was a critique, a long-standing critique of the priesthood and the temple that goes back, well, we see to Jeremiah, but even before, we see it in the Psalms and we see it in Micah, we see it in many places. And so Jesus is reflecting this. And what Jesus is reflecting is a concern with the temple, its financial or its economic practices, all right? Because the priests, and we'll see this when we get to the 12th chapter. See, the priests ran the temple, and they got rich running the temple. And at times they seem to forget that the main purpose of the temple was to be a conduit between the people and God, because priests used it often as their own piggy bank, and they received portion of all tithes and offerings, but they instituted 7 more classes of offerings, lucrative offerings, that mostly went to their benefit. And some of them were extremely high. For instance, if a man goes, well, would be a man. If a man wanted to be cleansed or redeemed for a sin, he would go to the priest, but he'd have to pay the priest. And sometimes he'd have to pay as much as 50 shekels, which was a huge amount of money. And so the priests were so bad that Martin Goodman, the Jewish scholar, said that the priests purposely loaned money to peasants to pay their taxes and to pay their tithes, knowing, often hoping, that they would default so they could take their land. And in fact, we're told that some 2/3 of the land of Galilee was owned by the priests and the party of Herod, of the Herods. And so this is what we're talking about is a real rapacious situation. And to give you an idea of just how devious the priests could be, in their exploiting the people. Of course, we don't see that happen, by in Christendom. Of course, we don't see that in the part of preachers or anything. But what we did see back then was very, very, very cynical. We know that we're told that in the 7th year, Leviticus 25 tells us in the 7th year, all debts are supposed to be forgiven in the sabbatical year, the 7th year. And what that would mean is that if you had a loan outstanding, if you're a rich person with a loan outstanding, you'd lose the amount of your loan. You lose your principal. Excuse me. And what it also meant is that priests no one would lend money going toward the 7th year, maybe not after the 3rd year, because they were afraid that they lose their money. And so the priests came up with something they call the prosbul, which literally means pros before boule means the court, prosbul, before the court, where it was a mechanism by which a lender could deposit his certificate attesting to the loan and in the temple. They said to the court, but in the temple. And that would suspend the sabbatical year. They could leave it there for the sabbatical year and then take it up after the sabbatical year. And what that would mean is that people's debts would never be forgiven, and that would end up with a perpetual underclass, a perpetual impoverished debtor class. The reason that we have estate taxes is to keep that from happening, supposedly. But George Bush got rid of the estate tax. But of course, that's a good Pharisaic way of doing things. But anyway, just wanted to give you a sense of how corrupt these priests could be. But despite the fact that the priests got so rich off the people, in fact, there was a priestly quarter on Upper Jerusalem that was so huge that and so rich, it was as rich comparatively as any rich community in America. In fact, the high priest's home we're told in the Gospel, John was so large that it had a room so large that the 71-member Sanhedrin Council could meet in the priest's home. In fact, there was a gatehouse where they stopped Peter outside the high priest's home. So that gives you a sense of just how rich these people were. But the problem was they did not, for all the money they got from the people and all the deference they got from the people got very little in return. We read the Gospels and we don't see the priests out among the people, out in among the rural people, certainly not in Galilee, ministering to the people unless they came out to question them, like we see in John, where they come out to ask, to challenge John the Baptist or challenge Jesus. And so, there was this real class rift, which we talked about early on when the Persians defeated the Babylonians and repatriated the Judahites back into Israel and in return, they instituted the high priesthood. The Persians did, to serve their own interests, and the high priest instituted a daily sacrifice for the welfare of the emperor, whatever emperor was oppressing the Israelite people. And so we see that the priesthood was largely enthralled to, at Jesus' time, to the Roman emperor. And they sort of kept the people quieted down. And so they would not revolt. And to give you an idea of how much the people resented the economic exploitation of the priests, and particularly with regard to debt, which Jesus even talked about, as we talked about last week, even talked about that in the Lord's Prayer, is that when they attacked the temple in 66 to destroy the temple in 66 AD, the first thing they did, we're told by Josephus, our witness from that period, said the first thing they did was destroy the temple debt archives. So that gives you a good sense of what was on the people's mind. Josephus also gives us a blanket assessment of the exploitative practices of the priestly aristocracy. He said the high priest Ananias was a great procurer of money. The other priests acted in like manner. And then there was a lament that comes from that period that said, "Woe unto me because of the house of Bothus, Hanan, Catharus, Ismail ben Finabi, for they are high priests, and their sons are treasurers, and their son-in-laws are overseers, and their servants beat the people with sticks." So it wasn't no silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. It was a time of real exploitation and oppression. And so when Jesus goes into the temple, the reason I started with the verse that said he entered Jerusalem, went to the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Clearly, he was going to scope the place out. Why else would he? He said he went and looked around and then he left. So when he came back, he knew what he's coming back for. This was a demonstration against the priestly aristocracy. Now, some folk will say, well, he was just disrupting the money changers because they were overcharging the people. Well, maybe they were overcharging the people, even though money changers were important to change the profane Roman money into sacred Jewish shekels to deposit in the temple. But it was more than that. The whole temple apparatus is what Jesus was demonstrating against, because we're told he goes in and he turns the money changers tables over and all of that. And think about this now. You all, most of you are sitting in your homes. If somebody came and knocked your computer over, you'd have a fight. Well, imagine this by himself. He's supposed to go by his lonesome self and knock all these tables over and knock people's money and all that, and nobody stops him. You know what I'm saying? I mean, knock their money off the table? No, no, no. What that said tells us a couple of things. One thing, that he wasn't alone. Who might it have been? Maybe it was those who greeted him when he made that triumphal entry. I mean, I would expect that would be some of the ones that did it. Not only that, we see that what stopped the money changers from stopping Jesus was either his violent act or his threat of violence. All right, but there's a certain violence when you take people's stuff and throw it around. All right, now, why did he do that? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One was to show the sense of outrage at the temple financial apparatus, but also it was to show that those who run the temple, that they weren't as powerful as everyone thought they were. You know, the people were afraid to stand up to them. But Jesus went, turned the tables over, turned the money over, and all of that. And then we're told he kept anyone from walking over the temple grounds. Well, the temple grounds were 33 square acres. So he couldn't do it by himself. So what we're told is that by this act, we can imagine that when Jesus came in and started turning things over, that people were in there noticed, and then he must have caught their attention and their imagination, and because it would have had to be the people there who kept the money changers and the temple guards from attacking Jesus. And then if he stopped people from walking across the courtyard, 33 square acres, what we see is Jesus is standing up and he is showing the weakness of, he's showing the people that the temple apparatus was not as strong, as all powerful as he thought, and that they had a right to question. See, a lot of times, and look at our churches, a lot of times our people don't think that they have a right to question at all. They'll quote the Psalms, touch not the head of my anointed, when it's not talking about preachers, it's talking about David. Every preacher is not necessarily anointed. How do you know they're anointed? By the way they act, not by the way they preach. Not just by the way they preach, right? And the anointing thing is something else I'd love to talk about sometime, because that is just so, that's just so abused. Everything's anointed now. If you raise your voice, it's anointed. That's anointed. It's just a mess. But anyway, so okay, I'm just checking the time. Yeah. But another reason that Jesus is so upset. No. Okay, another indication that Jesus is there to demonstrate to the people that the priestly aristocracy is not omnipotent, and that the people should question them and stop supporting them to the same extent, maybe. And we see this in chapter, an indication of that in chapter 12. I think this is very important. So if we go to chapter 12, 38 following. He begins by denouncing the scribes. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and place of honor at banquets." Whew, man, sound like folk I know. Have the best seats in the synagogues and place of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. I'm sorry. I have to... Whoa, man, I'm not. Okay, no comment. Verse 41. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Now, wait a minute. This doesn't say he just came back to the temple. This is the next day after he had turned the money changers out and waged that demonstration. In fact, let me just back up for a moment. When he waged that demonstration, imagine what that meant to the people to see one of them, a poor Galilean peasant who talked bad Hebrew and Aramaic like they did, stand up to these big-time priests, tell them about themselves, turn them out, hold court, and hold the temple hostage for a period, and then just turn around and walk out like a natural man without anybody stopping him. Can you imagine what that meant and how inspiring and empowering that was to the everyday people? To see that throughout history, we've seen it happen over and over when somebody stood up and took the kind of stand expressing loudly what many people were afraid to even think. That's inspired revolutions in history. So imagine the impact that had on the people. Of course, they had to kill Jesus, because to continue doing things like that would have fomented a revolution, not necessarily a violent revolution, but it certainly would have changed things. So he sat down opposite the treasury. Of all the places Jesus could have gone, he went to the treasury, where the money is, right after he had really scathingly criticized the scribes, saying that they devour widows' houses, which is one of the worst things you could do, according to the Hebrew Bible. So he sat across from the treasury where the money was, and the money was deposited. After he had waged that demonstration in the temple against the financial apparatus. So he comes back and then sits across from the treasury. He's not through yet. It says, many rich people put in large sums in the treasury. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then Jesus called his disciples and said to them, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Oh, I remember growing up that I used to hear this a lot, praising this woman. She was so self-sacrificial that she would put in all her money in the treasury, leaving herself not even enough to eat with. And we thought that Jesus was praising this woman, but let's look at it in context. Now, as we read through Mark 11 and following, the chapters following, Jesus is engaged in critiquing the priesthood, the priestly aristocracy, the temple priesthood. He's critiquing and criticizing quite scathingly their financial practices. the way they have people thinking that supporting the temple is the most important thing in the world, and that you should give your money to support the temple, even if you have to hurt yourself. And the priests were so bad that if you didn't do that, that often they send their servants to the threshing floor to take your production, your produce, to take their cut. And so Jesus is angry with them. So angry, he goes through all that knocking stuff over. And so then when he comes to the treasury, talks about how a widow puts everything in, nothing left to eat. He's still supposed, all of a sudden he's supposed to be happy? No, he even says in verse 40, they devour widows' houses. And then he talks about this woman who puts in everything. Now, if we go back to Jeremiah 7, we see some interesting things in it. In Jeremiah 7, he says, the Lord says through Jeremiah, do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord. This is the temple of the Lord. This is the temple of the Lord. Or in our contemporary parlance, this is the church of the Lord. This is the house of the Lord. This is the house of the Lord. Folk they treat our church buildings like God dwells there, and like it's one of the more important things we can do, to give money to the point that it might even hurt ourselves and our families to support these buildings. People need to support their churches, but then you have all these building campaigns to build 10, 20, 40, 50, $60 million churches. I'm not exaggerating. And I was a member of one church. It was like you almost had to be rich to be a member there. I mean, they was always asking for $1,000 here and there. You know, I mean, it's crazy. So Jeremiah is saying that these are deceptive words. You don't hide. You can't hide behind, well, this is the temple of the Lord, so this is why you have to do this. No. But then what's really gets you is that he says, for if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly one with another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, the widow, well, we know that one of the worst sins is to oppress the widow or an orphan or an alien immigrant. But here we have a widow who has been so tricked by this temple, or we might call it this church ideology, that she thinks that she'll get a heap of blessings if she gives everything that she has to the church, that she'll get even more in return. And I know the scripture. Jesus talks about, giving and you'll get more in return. You'll get more in return. But when you have a temple and you have priests who live large anyway, and we don't have much evidence of them going out among the people and helping them, and in fact, they look down on the people. And in fact, in John, I think John 7:49, he says, these people who do not know the law are cursed. He's talking about, this crowd which does not know the law, they are cursed. How are you going to talk about your parishioners, as your congregants, as cursed? Because they don't really know. I mean, they look down on these people, on the everyday people. And so they treated everybody badly. They didn't serve anyone really. And they looked down on the Galilean people, Jesus people. And then we see them exploiting even widows. So what I'm trying to relate to you are a couple things. One is that this is very strategic. Jesus is doing this. He cleansed the temple, and then he went and sat outside the temple and criticized the temple, because this is a strategy for a couple things: to raise the people's consciousness, to demystify the power of those in power, and also to bring people to a certain point of outrage, righteous outrage, at their oppression and their exploitation. So, as a strategy, Jesus giving voice to the voiceless through the demonstration at the temple has several elements. One was that confronting those in power at the seat of their power discredits their authority. Another is symbolically occupying the seat of power discredits the myth of invincibility. A poor peasant can go into the temple and defy the whole temple apparatus and walk out. That discredits the myth of its invincibility. And what it also does is open the door for other folk to realize that they can protest and that they can question. You must remember, most people are afraid often to question or to confront in temple or in church because of this veneer of divine power that these institutions seem to have, when institutions don't have divine power at all. They're part of human-made bureaucracies. The divine power inheres in the people, in the congregation, in their righteousness and their spirituality. But we can invoke, like Jeremiah says, this is the house of the Lord, the house of the Lord, the house of the Lord. Watch what you say. You should not question us. You should not oppose us. Well, no, man. God doesn't have a house. God has the world. And we each have a right to stand up and question. Jesus demonstrated that. And his maintaining control of the site long enough and staying there as long as he chose to until he decided to leave, it was perceived as an actual challenge to the authorities' power. Not just a symbolic one, but actual. He actually was in charge and wouldn't let people cross the temple grounds. And in doing this out loud among the people, with all kinds of boldness and bravery. I mean, it took a lot of boldness and bravery for him to do this in the temple, considering that the fortress of Antoniah was right next to the temple, where all the Roman soldiers were, who the priests were called to come in and keep order. That took a lot of courage, and that was dramatic enough to capture the people's imagination. I suggest that Jesus made this public demonstration to capture the people's imagination. He could have preached on it only if he wanted to, but the fact that he made it a physical demonstration right there in the temple, strategically, he wanted to catch the people's imagination. And then he made this incredible show of strength by leaving unscathed. So in so doing, he highlighted the abuses of the temple, particularly when, and with regard to the widow, we call with the widow's mite. He gave voice to undoubtedly what many others were feeling, but were afraid to say, or were afraid to act on for fear that they might anger God. What Jesus showed them is that standing up to the priest doesn't mean that you're standing against God. So he validated people's complaints by voicing them out loud and showing real righteous indignation against them to show how wrong they are. And he invalidated the legitimacy of those in authority. He did not acknowledge the priest's authority. If we go to John chapter 15, where Jesus says, I am the true vine. The Greek construction there is what they call a emphatic contrastive. It's like saying, the Greek says I twice. So it's not just I am, it's I am the true vine. In other words, they are not. I am the true vine, and you're already clear, you're already clean, you're already purified, because I have purified you. And in saying that, what Jesus is saying is that he was invalidating the only duty of the defining duty of priests. Priests existed to offer sacrifices to purify one and to be an intercessor with God. Well, Jesus says, no, I am the true vine. I have made you clean. In other words, you don't need them. And so he demystifies the people's power. He invalidates, he demystifies the priest's power, and he invalidates their legitimacy by questioning their whole existence and defying their whole existence. Now, this is a strategy. I hope it's clear how this is a strategic intervention, because it is a strategy. It is a way that Jesus inspired, but also empowered the people. It was a strategy to empower the people, to show that they could stand up, and that they had the right to stand up, and that they didn't have to fear the wrath of God or the wrath of the priestly aristocracy. And we've seen this strategy numerous times in history, but one of the most recent was the March on Washington, I think. We saw the same thing happen. We saw there was not one singular person, but it was a movement with a leader, of course, Martin Luther King. But this movement went right to the seat of power. And the president, Kennedy, tried to stop it. All kinds of folk tried to stop it. They said they were coming anyway. The president had amassed on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., 100,000 soldiers, expecting that he might have to turn them loose on the crowd if the crowd got carried away. But Martin Luther King and the March on Washington came into Washington. They decried the abuses of racism and segregation against the people. Martin Luther talked about a bad check that the people were given, and that it was the urgency of now that had to be responded to. And they had all these speakers that talked about not only the racism, the segregation, but also spoke boldly about our desire, the desire of our people to be free. And they said whatever they had to say, as long as they wanted to say it, then the crowd turned around and left, and in its own time. And it did not allow itself to be cowed by anything or anybody. And that was so empowering to Black people. To this day, of course, we all know that we still use that as a touchstone. But Jesus clearly, consciously strategized this when he went to the temple. We're told he looked all around and then left and went to the Mount of Olives. I suspect he went to the Mount of Olives and sat around with the disciples, strategizing on how they were going to do this thing. Went to the temple, They did their thing. They did it to the nth degree, and then they left, and they didn't run. They walked, and then they came back, and he sharpened his critique. This is something that I think that we can really learn from in the church. The importance of demystifying the religious establishment and religious institutions, because it's quite often they exploit the people, sometimes without realizing it, but other times quite cynically so. Some of you might have seen a video on the internet. I've seen it on Facebook, and there are those who say we shouldn't name names, and I'm saying that's exactly what we should name. So they had this woman who called herself a prophetess, Juanita Bynum, saying the Spirit of the Lord just spoke to her in this church service and said, 21 people in here have $1,000. The Spirit spoke to her and told the Spirit of God spoke to her and told her that there are 21 people in that room who had $1,000 to contribute. Now, what kind of mess is that? But exploitation of the people. And we allow that to stand. Now, the problem was there were people shouting when she was saying that mess. Now, if somebody stood up in there and said, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Of course, they would have been held to pay. But these people have to be challenged. Maybe not disrespectfully, but ask a question. But wait a minute. Why would the Lord tell you to ask people for $1,000 or something like that? And then how about Jeremiah said you can't hide behind this is the house of the Lord. This is the house of the Lord. This is the house of the Lord. But we do that all the time. There are preachers. If a preacher says something questionable or something clearly wrong from the pulpit, which the preacher does not own, what? Why can't we question? Excuse me, Pastor, wait a minute. Excuse me, sir. Pardon me. With all due respect, but what do you mean by that? Or where is that in the scripture? Or doesn't that contradict something? But no, we treat this the house of the Lord, and you are disrespecting the house of the Lord, and all that. And this is just foolishness, because the church, the Greek ekklesia, we translate the church as mean those who are called out. You know, you got a church if you don't have a building. That's what's important. So Jesus, when he cleansed the temple, he set a model for all of us. I mean, we don't have to usually won't have to take such extreme actions. But we could take some action, and maybe if you don't do in the service, you do it after service. But what Jesus also showed is that the people who are to be served by their religious leaders have a right to question their leaders and to challenge them, because they're not the subjects of these religious leaders. They're not the subjects. They might be their constituents, but they are those that the leader is supposed to be serving. And then that raises other questions about how we act like our leaders have a right and pastors have a right to live better than everybody else, like these priests in the temple. Now I'm going to say some things, and I'm just speaking biblically. no insult meant or anything. But I'm from Farmville, Virginia, and I was born there and spent some time, but most of my youth I grew up in the north. But I know in the churches, those little churches, so small that sometimes they had to share preachers, such that each church might only be open 1 or 2 Sundays a month because they don't have enough money to pay the pastor, so he has to have 2, 3 churches. Okay, understand that. And so when it comes time for the pastor's anniversary, of course, you're going to raise as much money as we can because these people have been serving, they ain't been getting paid. But now that's not the case. And so you have pastors, they're celebrating their first anniversary. And people are raising as much money as they can while they've been paying these pastors all year. Now, there are pastors, who making close to 6 figures. And folks still have this pastor's anniversary. And I mean, it's a tradition to raise as much money as you can for the pastor. But we have to question these things because that money could be put to better use to serve the people, particularly when the pastor's already getting tax-free salary and living tax-free. Jesus questioned these traditions. He questions. I mean, one thing that we must question. It's not even a question; it's a fact. I've talked about it before, but there's nothing wrong with tithing, and there's a lot right with it. I would think. Dedicating oneself to making a pledge for tithing to the church or anything else, like with any other pledge. There's a lot of power in that and discipline and all that. But when Malachi asks, will you rob the church? Malachi's talking about folks, he's talking largely to the Galileans who weren't bringing their tithes to the church, to the temple. Will you rob God? He asked. Well, what he's really saying is, will you rob the temple? Which means, will you rob me? Will you not give money to me? But the point I'm making is, when he asked that question, he's talking about the temple. Tithing is only for the temple. When the temple was destroyed, tithing was no longer a commandment. And so we have to stop telling our people, reading that to people, will you rob God? No, that has nothing to do with us. And we don't have the right to shame people and all that, and treat tithers special, have a tithers march. Everybody can't tithe. And to say, well, you tithe, the Lord will give it to you. Not necessarily. We see that doesn't always happen. The Lord gives us minds to do financial planning too, and all of that. But we have to start what Jesus modeled for us was the fact that we can ask that we have the right and the responsibility to reform our religious institutions by standing up and ask questions and opposing wrongdoing and opposing exploitation. I got to tell you, the prosperity anti-gospel is an anti-gospel. To say, I don't care how unjust the pie is, I just want to get my biggest slice of it. That's not biblical. That's selfish, and it's also it shows no social responsibility. It doesn't reflect love for neighbor at all. It just reflects, self-obsession, which is not biblical. Remember, the Hebrew Bible has no word for individual. Individualism does not count. It's always about looking out for our neighbors and for people. And so we have to keep that mind in mind in our churches, and get rid of the hierarchies and all of that. And what Jesus also modeled was to stop holding these religious leaders up like they are a higher form of humanity, like they're and acting like they're an intercessor between us and God. I need the pastor to pray for me. No, you don't need the pastor to pray for you. You know, what you need to do is pray for yourself and study and meditate and because the truth be told, there in some, there are people in the pews who are a lot more spiritually evolved than some pastors. And in my experience, than a lot of pastors. And so Jesus' strategy was to empower the people, to model for the people what they can and should do to bring some kind of justice and equanimity to the situation. Um, and he modeled raising people's consciousness and empowering them by speaking out. You can be as respectful as one needs to be. But often remember that if you see something that's very wrong going on, that there are other people who see the same thing, but if no one's speaking out, they're questioning themselves. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just me. So Jesus' cleansing of the temple just is very, very, very major model for us to follow, not only in our churches, but of course in our society, in our body politic. The importance of standing up and demystifying the claims and the power of these people. And I'm going to just end with my own personal editorial statement. But we have to do that with Christian nationalists and Jesus and the Christo-fascists. We have to stand up and demystify their calls. And in my latest book, Christians Against Christianity, I show in Trump's own words and his own words just how irreligious he is, just how unchristian he is, just how ridiculous it is that people could hold him up as a religious figure and follow him in the name of Christ. We have a responsibility to stand up against that too. And I really have a problem with pastors who are sitting on their rusty dusties, collecting shekels, but not fighting for the rights and welfare of the people. I thank you all for your attention and for your patience with me. I'm not going to say putting up with me, but I know I say some things that might be a little rankling sometime, but hopefully I don't in these sessions, hopefully I don't say anything that cannot be supported by the biblical witness itself. So God bless everybody. Thank everyone. And let's just look forward to building a better church with a capital C and a better nation. Thank you, Dr. Owens.
Thank you, Dr. Hendricks, so much for another great session that has ended way too soon. To everybody, again, you'll receive the recording in your email address probably by the end of the week. And you can also review the recording on the Hood Theological Seminary YouTube channel. So we'll see you next Monday, March the 4th, 6:00 p.m. The session will be titled Exposed to Oppose Systemic Oppression from Matthew 20. And you'll receive the reminder Zoom link also in your inboxes. Dr. Hendricks, we will see you really soon. Good night, everyone. Take care of yourselves.
Good night.
Peace.
Good night.
Good night.